Next time you're at the Gettysburg Museum, there is a very nondescript, it'd be very easy to miss artifact in the museum, and it's one of my favorite artifacts that I've ever seen in any museum, and it is a small piece of hardtack. It's a circular piece of hardtack, it's about that big around, and it was written on in pencil, and it was given to a civilian by a soldier who was marching through Summit Point, and it was given to that soldier here in Summit Point, and it is one of the best preserved pieces of Civil War hardtack that there is. So anytime I'm in Summit Point, I always think about that little piece of hardtack. So the next time you're in Gettysburg and you're in that museum, you can say, hey, I've been to Summit Point. It probably tastes exactly today the way it would have tasted to them then. I'm gonna try and point out some things on the fly as we go along here. So you're gonna have to really, we're not slowing down and stopping. Some of them are in some turns and bends. So I'm gonna try hard to point out a few things. The Grantham House, which figures extremely prominently into a lot of the James Taylor sketches. I'm going to try and point that out to you as well. And I also want to, again, keep trying to orient you as to where you are and kind of place you in the valley. If you look way off to the left beyond these houses, as you get a glimpse, you'll see a ridge line running out there. That's the western edge of the Shenandoah Valley. That's that Allegheny Ridge that we were pointing out on our bus tour on Thursday. So that's generally west-northwest. Now that is called North Mountain in the valley because, as you are probably very well aware, the valley runs from southwest to northeast. It doesn't run north-south. So no matter where the settlers were in the valley, if they looked to the north, they'd see that mountain, even though we kind of think of it as running on the west. Now this house right in front of the bus, this is the Grantham House. This will become Wilson's headquarters. And this is, you've got just phenomenal drawings of this house. When you get home, look at James Taylor's sketchbook. This figures into it. And John Bracken, who owns the Bracken Museum, at one time lived right here in this house. As we're going down, we're on Summit Point Road now. This would have been that main route that takes you down towards the old Charlestown Road and then on to Winchester. And it's called the old Charlestown Road because it ran this direction and would connect you to Charlestown from Winchester. This is the main thoroughfare. This is the road that Anderson would have been coming in on, and this is the road that Wilson came out on, and why they met out here at Summit Point. As we come down around this bend, there's a farm that's going to be on the left-hand side of the bus. It's called White House Farm. White House Farm is one of the oldest farms in this part of the valley. The small stone barn that you see sitting here on the left is one of the oldest extant barns in the Shenandoah Valley. And the spring that is here off to the right side of the bus and this house, again, figures very prominently in the James Taylor sketchbook. And Harry Gilmore gets into a little bit of trouble right here, and that's all sketched out in the sketchbook. And you'll be stunned to see it looks almost identical to the way it looks today, except for that god-awful addition they put on the back. What the hell's with that? Gosh, you don't come up here for 20 years. And again, as we're going through here, I pointed out very quickly, we actually went through here on the same road on Thursday, but this is where George Washington's first bullskin plantation was. Down off here to the right of the bus, that all of this ground off to the right, all the ground off to the left, all would have belonged to George Washington at the ripe old age of 16. I don't think many of us started out quite as well. But if you were to go down underneath these power lines and down over into that direction, there was, that's where his bullskin plantation was. And eventually the Burns family would build a house on the foundations of George Washington's early home. And they would call it Rock Hall. Rock Hall would burn in the early 20th century. But the Burnses would hold on to the property, and I don't know who owns it now. But if you go down this road right here to the right, you see some buildings back in there. George Washington's slave quarters and spring house. that he built before the French and Indian War. Remnants of both of those buildings are still back there. We are going to talk a little bit about the town of Charlestown itself and the prominence of the town, and a lot of the prominence of the town comes from the Washington family, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But getting back to the Civil War and connecting that to the Washingtons, the Washington family is still living out here at the time of the war. So George Washington's great nephews are living out here. By that time, Mount Vernon has been sold. There really are not a lot of personal items that are sold with the house. The real estate's sold, but a lot of George and Martha's things are still retained either by the Custis Lee family or by the Washington nephews who live out here. And after the war, one of the ways that the family recovers from their wartime losses is by selling off at auction a lot of George Washington's things. And they're bought by libraries and private collectors, and they go for a good bit of money. And that's how the Washington family gets back on its feet, at least in part, following the war. The Burns family, who owned George Washington's plantation, and in the 1930s moved to that house, and they still live there today. Yeah, so the question, so Dr. Willen's asking about the guy that John Brown captured, and that was Lewis Washington. That was George's nephew, Lewis. Remind me, and I will point out the direction where that happened. One of the things that people might not know is that Lewis Washington's son was James B. Washington. And if you've ever seen the photograph of Custer sitting with a Confederate friend, there's a Confederate and you know, it's Custer, and that Confederate officer, his young friend, that's James B. Washington. That's Lewis Washington's son. And Lewis Washington is the one that gets taken out of his bed in the middle of the night by John Brown and his raiders, and they steal Washington's sword, and all of that happens closer to Harper's Ferry, and I'll point that out this afternoon as we go there. But that image, that very famous image, that's John B. Washington, first cousin of all the Washingtons that are living on this side of Charlestown, and he would have been entertained quite often at these plantations as well. So there's a phenomenal connection. So getting back to that, the Washingtons, I was asked this on Thursday, the Washingtons were Southern sympathizers. The Washingtons sided with the Confederacy at the time of the war, and they were involved. All the young men that were of military age and healthy enough to go. There was some serious health issues in a lot of the lines of that family. Served in the military. Bushrod Corbin Washington, a great image of him. He was a lieutenant in the 12th Virginia Cavalry. He'll write the foreword for. Is it Baylor that wrote the book on who wrote the book on the Laurel Brigade? Did Baylor write that book? Anyway, he'll write the foreword for that book. He knew Jeb Stuart well, and he knew Fitz Lee, and he was a cavalry guy, and so he was very prominent in the war. But all of those cousins fought, and they fought for the Confederacy. The Sheets that we're stopping at is the same Sheets where Sheridan.
Well, they are Pennsylvania, Katie Washington. We'll see this week. I'm sure there are.
Bit story here. The back entrance to Claymont Plantation is right up here on the right as we go around this bend, and Claymont Plantation, Washington family plantation, is off here to the right, and it's named for that hill that you see in the right. They called it Clay Mount originally. And my very first attempt to preserve land, battlefield land, was right here in this bend. And I was meeting with a developer from outside of Washington, D.C., and we were riding in his fancy vehicle, and We pulled into the back gate right here around this bend, and when he got out of the car, he stepped right into a deer carcass. And that entrance is right, used to be right, it's right here. He stepped into a deer carcass right there, and I said, he said, "Oh my gosh, what is that?" And I said, "Well, that's what's left of the last developer that came out here." In James Taylor's sketchbook, there is an image of a gun emplacement, a very stationary kind of vedette gun emplacement, and that sat right here on this rise, and it was a permanent fortification, semi-permanent fortification, guarding this approach into Charlestown. Now, as we're going around this next bend, you are starting to get onto a plantation called Allatoona, and Allatoona was one of the largest farms in the area at the time of the war. And what makes it extremely unique is that it is still today owned by the family that owned it prior to the war. When we go out Route 51, you're going to get a better view of that. And when the Washingtons rebuilt following the war, they had to sell off most of the plantation, but their last house they had in this part of the county was right up there in that little clump of trees up there, and it was named Braddock. The reason it was named Braddock is because out there in that clump of trees is one of the last remaining Braddock wells, one of the big, deep wells that were dug for Braddock's army. That was located not too long ago with a young lady by the name of Susan Pierce. You can see Allatoona off to the left. You can see the farm buildings out there. The slave-built stone wall on both sides of Route 51 is still running right in front of the farm buildings over there. And that, the uniform of the owner of the farm at the time of the war still exists. It's in a private collection. During the war, Davenport was at the hanging of John Brown, and again, his uniform, including cap, trousers, coat, all still exist in a private collection. Henry Davenport. Switching back to 1862, because I can't help but to point it out to you, is right here along these railroad tracks off to the left where Stonewall Jackson boarded the train as his men are extricating themselves from this part of the valley, trying to get back up past Strasburg before the noose is closed around his neck. If you'll remember, as his men are marching, he's going to get on that train and he's going to go ahead to Winchester so that he can help direct affairs there by the time they get there. It's right in here along that flat spot of the tracks where he will board that train. You're coming into Charlestown right now. For those of you who've not spent much time here, this is like every southern town, there's always a hill called Potato Hill. This is Potato Hill. And as we're cresting it, look through to the front of the bus, and you will see the boxy bell tower from the courthouse where John Brown was tried. That's the famous courthouse. The smaller brick spire you see in front of that is kind of marking the approximate location of the of the market hall on the square, and the jail is right there, the same square. All of that, again, figuring very prominently into John Brown's trial and his execution. We're going to make a right here, and when we make this right, we're going to be heading back out of town. But again, referring to James Taylor's sketchbook, it's a wonderful sketch of this exact location with an army making the same turn, which is pretty fascinating. You really can't overstate the prominence of the families that lived in Charlestown in the 19th century. Again, you had the Washingtons. You also had the Pendleton family. Pendleton, I believe, was one of the early secretaries of the Navy. Very, very prominent families. We make this bend and clear the edge of town here. The land that opens off to the left, that was all originally part of the Pendleton farm. I think one of the most unique things about the Pendleton farm is they had the very first gas lights, maybe in the valley. And what they did was there was no gas that was piped to the farm. They had a gas cave, and they would take manure and put it in this enclosed cave and let the methane build up. And they had a system of piping that methane into the house, and they had gas lights way out here. That was a pretty big deal. And that's off here to the left. The house still stands back there, at least it did at some point in the not too distant past. The other thing that's really great about that plantation house is that Washington Irving, who wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, came and spent 2 months at the Pendleton farm here when he was writing his books, The Life of Washington. And he stayed with the Pendletons and then would visit the Washington family and spend time with them and learn about their uncle, George Washington. But that's right back in here is where that farmhouse was. Following the war, the area right here along what we now call Route 340, right in this area, there were 3 black communities developed after the war for former slaves, and one of them was here, and it was known as Gibsontown, and there was one called Big End and one called West End, and they eventually, most of them ended up as domestic and ground servants for the families who lived in town, paid by that time, but very much living in the same social structure that they were prior to the war. Now, we're gonna stop here at Sheets to use the restroom. We have snacks on the bus. We have snacks on the bus. No reason to get in line and hold us up getting something in here. And I'd also like to ask you to consider staying on the bus if you don't have to use the restroom. Because the faster we move, the more we can show you. And all jokes aside, Scott and I have this list of things we'd like to show you, and depending on how fast we can get around and where we can get the buses, that list gets shorter and shorter. So if you don't have to get off the bus, please feel free to stay on the bus.